She walked into the courthouse at 8 o'clock in the morning wearing a simple black suit, no jewelry, no makeup beyond a subtle lip balm. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. Her shoes were practical black flats, worn at the heel from years of use. She carried a leather briefcase that had been her mother's, scuffed and faded from decades of professional work. She looked exactly like what everyone assumed she was, a cleaning woman coming to do her job before the courthouse filled with lawyers and judges and important people. Nobody noticed her arriving. Nobody looked up from their phones or their conversations. Nobody thought to offer her directions or to welcome her. She simply walked through the marble halls, past the security desk where the guards barely glanced at her, past the courtrooms where proceedings were beginning, toward the chambers of Judge Harmon, who was retiring after 40 years of service. Before we start this story, I need you to do something for me. Leave a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know where my audience is in the world. And at the very end of the story, I need you to rate it from 0 to 10. Because this isn't just a story about a woman being judged by her appearance. This is a story about what happens when people see what they expect to see instead of seeing what's actually in front of them. This is a story about how snap judgments can blind us to reality. This is the story of Dr. Margaret Chen, a woman who'd spent 30 years becoming a brilliant jurist, only to discover that the moment she walked into a room, people saw a cleaning lady instead of a judge. Let's find out what happens when the truth is finally revealed. Let's find out who she really was all along. Margaret Chen was 58 years old. She'd been born in a small town in California to immigrant parents who'd sacrificed everything to send her to good schools. Her mother had been a seamstress. Her father had worked in a factory. Neither of them had finished high school. But they'd understood something profound. They understood that education was the only way their daughter could escape the kind of work that aged your hands and bent your back. Margaret had listened to them. She'd studied ferociously. She'd graduated top of her class in high school. She'd gone to Stanford on a full scholarship. She'd gone to Harvard Law School, where she'd graduated first in her class. She'd been a prosecutor for 10 years, building a reputation as someone who was brilliant and relentless. She'd been a defense attorney for 5 years, becoming known as the lawyer who could find reasonable doubt where nobody else could see it. She'd taught law at Berkeley for 8 years, publishing papers that were cited in legal journals across the country. She'd been a federal magistrate for 5 years, earning a reputation for being fair and intelligent. And now, at 58 years old, she'd been appointed as a federal judge. The appointment had been announced 6 months ago. The Senate had confirmed her 4 months ago. The news had been covered by legal journals and by local papers. There had been celebrations among her colleagues and her friends. But Margaret had barely had time to celebrate. She'd been too busy preparing for this day. Too busy making sure she was ready to take on the responsibility of being a federal judge. What nobody knew was that Margaret had made a conscious choice about how to present herself for this role. Nobody knew that she'd deliberately chosen to avoid the kind of appearance that judges were supposed to have. Nobody knew that she'd specifically decided against jewelry and makeup and expensive clothing. She'd made this choice because of something that had happened when she was a prosecutor. She'd been trying a case, a rape case, and she'd been wearing a designer suit and expensive jewelry. The defendant's lawyer had made a comment during cross-examination about how Margaret had obviously come from money and couldn't possibly understand the struggles of regular people. The comment had been ruled out of order, but the damage was done. The jury had been infected with doubt. The defendant had been acquitted. From that moment forward, Margaret had made a different choice. She'd chosen to dress simply. She'd chosen to present herself in a way that was deliberately understated. She'd done this because she wanted people to listen to her words, not to her appearance. She wanted to be judged on her intelligence and her legal reasoning, not on her clothes or her jewelry or the way she looked. What Margaret hadn't anticipated was what would happen when people literally couldn't see past her appearance. What Margaret hadn't anticipated was that by dressing simply, by refusing to perform the role of the important judge, she would become invisible in a different way. The morning of her first day, Margaret arrived at the courthouse at 8 o'clock. Judge Harmon's chambers were on the 4th floor. She'd been to these chambers many times before. During her years as a federal magistrate, she'd had friendly professional relationships with judges in this building. But she hadn't been to Judge Harmon's chambers specifically. Judge Harmon had been semi-retired for the past 2 years, appearing only occasionally to hear special cases. This was her chambers now. She climbed the marble staircase. Her footsteps echoed in the empty courthouse. She walked down a hallway lined with portraits of previous judges. All of them men, all of them white, all of them wearing the formal robes and formal expressions of the law. She would be the first woman to be appointed to the federal bench in this district in over 30 years. She would be the first judge of Asian descent in the history of this courthouse. She reached the chambers and knocked on the door. A man answered, a young man, probably in his 20s, wearing the casual clothes of a law clerk or a courthouse employee. "Hi," he said, not looking up from the papers he was holding. "Are you here to clean? Because we just got the office cleaned yesterday, but if there's something that needs to be done today, you can just do whatever. There's a supply closet on the 3rd floor. Just check in with the office manager before you get started." Margaret felt something shift inside her. She understood immediately what was happening. She understood that he saw a 58-year-old Asian woman in a simple black suit, and he'd assumed she was a cleaning woman. She understood that the invisibility she'd been cultivating for all these years had worked, but not in the way she'd intended. "Actually," she said, her voice calm and professional, "I'm Dr. Margaret Chen. I'm the new judge. I'm here to take possession of my chambers." The young man's face went white. He stared at her for a long moment, his brain clearly struggling to reconcile the person in front of him with the position he thought she was supposed to have. "Oh my God," he said finally. "I'm so sorry. I thought. Oh God. Welcome, Judge Chen. We weren't expecting you quite this early. I'm Thomas, by the way. I'm Judge Harmon's law clerk, but I'll be transitioning to work with you during the handover period. Please come in. Let me call the office manager. Let me make sure everything is ready for you." Margaret stepped into the chambers. They were beautiful. Wood-paneled walls, leather furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. There was a large oak desk with a computer and a phone. There were bookshelves filled with legal references. There was a portrait of Judge Harmon on one wall. There was a space on another wall where her portrait would eventually hang. She sat down at the desk and she felt something click into place. This was her space now. This was where she would spend the next 20 years of her career, hearing cases and making decisions that would shape the lives of people she'd never met. This was where she would finally become visible as the thing she'd always been, a brilliant judge who deserved respect. But first, she had to get through the rest of the courthouse. The first court session was scheduled for 9 o'clock. Margaret had decided to ease into her new position by observing a hearing in one of the other courtrooms before taking on her own docket. She walked downstairs to courtroom 3, where Judge Morrison was hearing a civil lawsuit. She stood in the back of the courtroom, watching as the case progressed. She was so focused on the legal arguments that she almost didn't notice when the bailiff approached her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and respectful but with an undertone of confusion. "We're about to start a hearing. You're going to need to leave the courtroom or sit in the proper seating area. You can't stand back there." Margaret looked at him. She understood what was happening. Her simple appearance was working against her again. The bailiff thought she was a spectator who was inappropriately positioned. He thought she was either a cleaning woman who'd wandered in or a member of the public who didn't know the rules. "I'm Dr. Margaret Chen," she said quietly, "the new federal judge. I'm observing this hearing." "Oh," the bailiff said, his face flushing. "I'm very sorry, Judge Chen. I didn't realize. Welcome to the courthouse. Please, you're welcome to stand anywhere you like. Or if you'd prefer, there's a judge's chamber off to the side where you can observe privately." Margaret accepted the offer and moved to the private chamber. She watched the rest of the hearing from there. But she was thinking about what had just happened. She was thinking about how much of her life had been spent being invisible, and how much of that invisibility had been deliberate. She'd built a career on the foundation of being underestimated. She'd won cases because opposing counsel had assumed she wasn't as smart as she actually was. She'd advanced in the legal profession because judges had dismissed her initial arguments and then been shocked when she proved them wrong. She'd become the attorney that other lawyers feared because they'd learned, too late, that the woman in the simple suit was the most intelligent person in the room. But now that she was a judge, invisibility wasn't an asset anymore. Now it was a liability. At 10 o'clock, Margaret returned to her chambers. Thomas, her law clerk, was there with several files stacked on her desk. "I've organized these by priority," he said, his manner now formal and respectful in a way it hadn't been earlier. Judge Harmon left notes on some of the ongoing cases. "There are 3 new filings that came in this morning. And there's a calendar of hearings scheduled for the next week. The first hearing is tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. It's a federal crime case, fraud and embezzlement." Margaret looked through the files. She was beginning to organize her thoughts about her docket when there was a knock on the door. An older woman poked her head in, probably in her 60s, wearing the kind of expensive dress and jewelry that judges' wives wore to courthouse functions. "Oh, good, Thomas, you're here," the woman said, not looking at Margaret. "I need to know where the supply closet is. There are some papers that need to be filed, and I've been looking for the filing cabinets all morning. Where would Judge Harmon keep them?" Margaret looked at the woman. She understood what was happening. The woman had walked in, seen Margaret sitting at the desk, and had assumed she was the law clerk. The woman had assumed that the man was in charge and the woman was the subordinate. "The filing cabinets are behind the door on the left," Margaret said, her voice calm. "But I think you might be looking for someone else. I'm Dr. Margaret Chen, the new judge. This is my office now." The woman's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. First confusion, then embarrassment, then a kind of defensive anger. "Oh," she said. "Well, I'm sorry for the confusion. I'm Patricia Morrison, wife of Judge Morrison. I was just looking for the filing system. Judge Harmon and my husband have always cooperated on administrative matters, and I thought maybe—" She trailed off, clearly not sure how to finish the sentence. "Judge Morrison is welcome to stop by if he needs to discuss anything," Margaret said. "But my administrative staff will handle my office's filing. You can talk to Thomas if there's something specific you need." Patricia Morrison left, but not before giving Margaret a look that suggested she'd just done something unforgivable. Margaret understood the look. She understood that she'd committed a social crime by not being gracious enough, by not being grateful enough that a judge's wife had taken the time to talk to her. She understood that the unspoken rule in the courthouse was that the wives of judges had a certain status, and that a new judge was supposed to defer to that status. But Margaret had stopped caring about unspoken social rules a long time ago. The rest of the day proceeded in much the same way. Margaret would encounter people in the hallways and they would assume she was someone's assistant or a clerk or a cleaning woman. She would correct them, each time watching their faces go through the same progression of confusion, embarrassment, and confusion again. By the end of the day, she'd had the experience corrected or assumed about her identity more than 20 times. By the end of the day, she was exhausted. She sat in her chambers at 6 o'clock after everyone else had left, and she looked at the empty portrait space on the wall. In a few weeks, her official portrait would arrive. A portrait that had been taken by a professional photographer. A portrait where she would be wearing the traditional judge's robes. A portrait where she would look exactly like what everyone expected a judge to look like. But even then she understood, there would be people who looked at her and saw something else. There would be people whose assumptions about what a judge should be would override the evidence of what was right in front of them. The first federal hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. The case was United States versus Richard Brennan, a case involving financial fraud and embezzlement. The defendant, Richard Brennan, was a wealthy businessman who allegedly embezzled over $5 million from his company. The prosecution was seeking a sentence of 15 years. The defense was arguing for a significantly reduced sentence based on cooperating with authorities and voluntary restitution. Margaret arrived at the courthouse at 8 o'clock. She went to her chambers and reviewed the case files one more time. The case was straightforward enough. Brennan had stolen from his company. There was documented evidence. There were witness statements. The defense's main argument was that his cooperation and restitution should result in a reduced sentence. At 8:55, she put on her judge's robes. She looked at herself in the mirror, The black robes hung from her shoulders formally. The robes transformed her in a way that her simple suit hadn't. The robe said, officially and undeniably, that she was a judge. The robe said that whatever anyone might assume about her based on her appearance, the truth was written in law. She walked down to the courtroom. The bailiff opened the door for her with a respectful nod. She walked to the bench and sat down. She looked out at the courtroom. There were about 30 people there. The defendant and his lawyers. The prosecution team. Reporters from the local news stations. Observers who were interested in the case. And in the back of the courtroom, there was a man in a maintenance uniform. Someone who appeared to be doing some kind of repair work in the corner. Margaret looked at the bailiff. "Is everyone here?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the bailiff replied. "We're ready to begin." "Then let's start," Margaret said. The hearing proceeded. The prosecution presented its case. The defense presented its case. Margaret listened carefully to both sides. She asked questions when she needed clarification. She took notes. She did exactly what a judge was supposed to do. And then something happened that nobody expected. The defendant, Richard Brennan, suddenly stood up. He was a large man, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and an expression of barely suppressed rage. "I want to know who this judge is," he said loudly. "I have a right to know who's deciding my case. This woman is not a federal judge. Federal judges don't look like cleaning ladies. Federal judges don't dress like they just came from mopping floors. I want a real judge hearing my case. I want someone who looks like a judge is supposed to look like." The courtroom went silent. The bailiff moved forward, ready to have Brennan removed. Margaret held up her hand. "You're right," she said calmly. "You do have a right to know who's deciding your case. My name is Dr. Margaret Chen. I am a federal judge, appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. I've been practicing law for 35 years. I graduated first in my class at Harvard Law School. I have published extensively on federal sentencing guidelines. I am, in fact, precisely the kind of judge that should be hearing your case." She paused, letting that sink in. "However," she continued, "your outburst has revealed something important. It has revealed that you have a bias against women who don't conform to your expectations of what a woman in authority should look like. It has revealed that you judge people based on appearance rather than competence. And it has revealed that you believe you have the right to object to a judge based on her gender presentation." She looked directly at him. "All of which are factors I will be considering during your sentencing," she said. The hearing continued for another hour. The defense presented its final arguments. Margaret took time to consider. Then she delivered her verdict. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "you embezzled $5 million from your company. You did this deliberately and with forethought. You did this over a period of years, knowing that what you were doing was illegal. However, you have cooperated with federal authorities, and you have made restitution to your company. These factors weigh in your favor." She paused. "But your behavior in this courtroom today reveals something troubling about your character. It reveals that you have a fundamental disrespect for authority that comes from women who don't conform to your narrow expectations. It reveals that you were willing to challenge the legitimacy of a federal judge based on her appearance rather than her credentials. This demonstrates a pattern of judgment that is concerning." She looked at her papers. "Therefore, I am sentencing you to 12 years in federal prison. You will also be required to pay an additional restitution of $100,000 to the victims of your crimes. You will begin your sentence in 30 days, which will give you time to prepare your affairs." The courtroom erupted. The defense lawyers stood up, objecting. The prosecutors looked surprised that the judge had split the difference between what they were asking for. Reporters started writing notes. And in the back of the courtroom, the maintenance worker looked up from his work and smiled. The news of the hearing spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By afternoon, everyone knew that the new judge, the woman who looked like a cleaning lady, had sentenced a wealthy businessman to 12 years in federal prison for his disrespectful outburst in court. Everyone knew that she had not tolerated his bias against her appearance. Everyone knew that she had demonstrated wisdom in her sentence by taking into account both his crimes and his character. By the end of the day, Margaret's reputation had completely shifted. She was no longer the invisible woman in the simple suit. She was the judge who didn't tolerate disrespect. She was the judge who made decisions based on principle rather than on what was expected of her. But something else happened too. Something that nobody expected. A video of the hearing was uploaded to social media. The video showed Brennan's outburst, his objection to Margaret's appearance, her calm and powerful response. The video went viral. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed by more than 1 million people. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed by more than 10 million people. The comments on the video were overwhelming. People praised Margaret for her composure and her intelligence. People criticized Brennan for his bias and his disrespect. People started to recognize Margaret's appearance, started to appreciate that she looked like a normal person instead of like a caricature of what a judge was supposed to be. And then something else happened. People started comparing Margaret's sentence to sentences delivered by other judges in similar cases. They discovered that her sentence was fair. They discovered that she wasn't being lenient or harsh. They discovered that she was applying the law exactly as it was supposed to be applied. Over the next few weeks, more people came to Margaret's courtroom. More people wanted to see the judge who had gone viral. More people wanted to observe the woman who had stood up to disrespect with such composure and intelligence. And as more people observed her, something interesting happened. They began to see her not as a cleaning lady, but as exactly what she was, a brilliant judge who made thoughtful decisions based on careful analysis of the law. They began to understand that her simple appearance didn't diminish her authority. It enhanced it. It showed that she didn't need the trappings of power to be powerful. She was powerful because she was intelligent and fair and principled. One afternoon, Margaret was having lunch in the courthouse cafeteria when a young woman approached her. The young woman was probably in her late 20s, wearing the kind of business casual clothes that a young lawyer would wear. "Excuse me," the young woman said. "Are you Judge Chen?" Margaret looked up. "I am," she said. "I just wanted to tell you," the young woman said, "that your video changed my life. I was thinking about not going to law school because I thought I wasn't going to fit the mold. I thought that I was going to have to change who I was to succeed in law. But watching you refuse to conform to expectations, watching you be exactly who you were, watching you succeed because of your intelligence, not despite your appearance, that changed everything for me. I decided to apply to law school. And I just got accepted." Margaret felt something shift inside her. She understood in that moment what her simple appearance had actually been. It had been a message. It had been saying that you didn't have to look a certain way to be powerful. You didn't have to perform an identity to be legitimate. You could be yourself and still succeed. "Thank you for telling me that," Margaret said to the young woman. "Good luck in law school. The profession needs more people like you." 6 months into her tenure as a federal judge, Margaret received a call from the president's chief of staff. The call was unexpected. Nobody had warned her that it was coming. "Judge Chen," the chief of staff said, "we've been following your work with great interest. We've seen the cases you've decided. We've seen the fairness and the intelligence in your rulings. We wanted to ask if you would be interested in being considered for the appeals court." Margaret was silent for a moment. The appeals court would be a significant step up from her position as a federal judge. It would mean reviewing the decisions made by other federal judges. It would mean even more visibility and even more responsibility. "I'm interested," she said finally. "But I want you to understand something. I'm not going to change who I am or how I present myself to fit the expectations of the position. If you want me on the appeals court, you're getting me as I am. Simple clothes, no jewelry, a woman who doesn't perform authority through appearance." "That's precisely why we want you," the chief of staff said. "Your case against Brennan went viral because people connected with your authenticity. People saw a judge who was more interested in being fair than in looking impressive. That's rare. That's valuable. That's what we need on the appeals court." 2 years after her first day at the federal courthouse, Margaret was confirmed as a judge on the federal appeals court. The confirmation hearing was televised. Senators asked her questions about her judicial philosophy. She answered honestly and directly. She talked about the importance of being fair to all parties, regardless of their appearance or their background. She talked about the value of applying the law with intelligence and care. She talked about the danger of making snap judgments based on appearance. During the confirmation hearing, one senator asked her a specific question. "Judge Chen," the senator said, "your first federal hearing went viral because of an unusual outburst by the defendant. He objected to your appearance. How did that experience shape your approach to judging?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "It confirmed something I'd always believed," she said. "It confirmed that people judge based on appearance all the time. They make assumptions about competence and authority based on how someone looks. And that's a problem, not just in the courtroom, but in society everywhere. The case showed me that my simple appearance, which I'd chosen deliberately to avoid being judged on appearance, was actually a teaching moment. It showed people that appearance doesn't determine competence. It showed people that a woman in a simple black suit could be just as authoritative, just as intelligent, just as worthy of respect as anyone else." She paused. "But more than that," she continued. "It showed me that some of the most important moments in our lives come when we choose to be authentic instead of performing what we think we're supposed to be. The moment I stood up and said who I actually was, not who people expected me to be, but who I actually was, that's when everything changed." After the confirmation hearing, Margaret walked out of the Senate chamber and she was surrounded by reporters. "Judge Chen, how does it feel to be confirmed to the appeals court?" one reporter asked. "It feels like recognition," Margaret said. "But not recognition of my appearance or my dress sense. Recognition of my work. Recognition of my intelligence. Recognition of my commitment to the law. That's the kind of recognition that matters." "Do you think your unusual appearance affected your confirmation?" another reporter asked. Margaret smiled slightly. "My appearance isn't unusual," she said. "I'm a 58-year-old woman wearing practical clothes. What's unusual is that people expected me to look different. What's unusual is that a federal judge would be judged based on whether she conforms to narrow expectations about how judges are supposed to look. I think that's what the American people reacted to. Not to my appearance, but to the recognition that appearance shouldn't determine competence." 10 years after her first day as a federal judge, Margaret was sitting in her chambers at the appeals court. She had a window that overlooked the city. She had shelves filled with the cases she'd decided over the years. She had walls covered with commendations and awards. And she was wearing a simple black suit, without jewelry, with her hair pulled back in a bun. A young lawyer came to her office for advice. The young lawyer was a woman, probably in her 30s, and she was clearly nervous. "Judge Chen," the young lawyer said, "I wanted to ask you something. I'm going to be presenting oral arguments in front of the appeals court next month, and I'm worried about whether I'll be taken seriously. I'm not what people expect a lawyer to look like. I don't have the traditional presentation." Margaret listened carefully. She understood exactly what the young woman was experiencing. She understood the fear of not being taken seriously because of appearance. "Let me tell you something," Margaret said. 20 years ago, when I first walked into a federal courtroom, I deliberately chose to dress simply. I did this because I wanted to be judged on my intelligence, not on my appearance. And you know what happened? People still judged me on my appearance. They still made assumptions about what I should be based on how I looked. The only thing that changed that was when I was undeniably, unmistakably brilliant at my job. When I made fair decisions. When I stood up for what was right." She paused. "So here's my advice to you," she continued. "Don't worry about whether you look like what people expect a lawyer to look like. Focus on being a brilliant lawyer. Focus on your arguments. Focus on your preparation. Focus on your intelligence. That's what will make you taken seriously. Not your appearance. Your competence." By the time Margaret reached her 60s, she was recognized as one of the most important federal judges in the country. Her decisions were cited in law schools. Her opinions influenced how other judges approached their cases. Her commitment to fairness and intelligence had changed the legal system in subtle but important ways. And she had done all of this while wearing simple black suits and no jewelry. She had done all of this while refusing to perform the role of judge through appearance. She had done all of this by being exactly who she was. One day, a news organization did a retrospective on Margaret's career. The retrospective included footage from her first hearing in federal court, the footage of Brennan's outburst, her calm response, her clear articulation of who she was. The retrospective also included interviews with other judges, other lawyers, and people whose lives had been affected by her decisions. One of the people interviewed was the man who'd been doing maintenance in the back of the courtroom that day. He'd since retired, but he remembered the moment clearly. "I was working in the back of the room," the man said in the interview, "and I heard this businessman start yelling about how the judge didn't look like a judge. And I heard her respond. And I remember thinking, that's power. That's what real power looks like. Not someone performing authority through clothes or jewelry or appearance. Someone who knows who she is and isn't afraid to say it." When Margaret retired at the age of 70, the legal community held a dinner in her honor. Over 500 people attended. Judges, lawyers, law professors, people whose lives had been affected by her decisions. The dinner was held at the finest hotel in the city. It was a formal occasion. Margaret could have worn something expensive and impressive for the event. But she didn't. She wore a simple black dress. No jewelry. Her hair pulled back in a bun. She arrived at the dinner and she was greeted with a standing ovation that lasted for more than 3 minutes. When it was time for speeches, judge after judge stood up and talked about Margaret's influence on the legal profession. They talked about her intelligence. They talked about her fairness. They talked about her integrity. Nobody mentioned her appearance except once, when one judge said, "Margaret taught us that the robes don't make the judge. The intelligence makes the judge. The fairness makes the judge. The integrity makes the judge." At the end of the evening, after all the speeches had been made and all the tributes had been paid, Margaret stood to say a few words. The room fell silent. "I came to the federal courthouse 20 years ago," she said, "not knowing how my appearance would be received. I came wearing a simple suit because I wanted to be judged on my intelligence, not on my clothes. And you know what? People still judged me on my appearance first. They still made assumptions. They still sometimes couldn't see past what was right in front of them." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of the people who'd supported her career. "But that's what made the work meaningful," she continued. "The work wasn't about proving that I could look like a judge. The work was about proving that competence and intelligence and fairness matter more than appearance. The work was about showing other people, especially other women, especially other people from marginalized communities, that they could succeed by being authentically themselves. They didn't have to perform authority. They didn't have to conform to narrow expectations. They could be exactly who they were and still be worthy of respect." She smiled. "And that," she said, "has been the greatest privilege of my career." So here's what I want to ask you in the comments section. Do you think Margaret made the right choice in how she presented herself as a judge? Do you think her simple appearance helped her or hurt her? Do you think Richard Brennan was justified in questioning her authority based on her appearance? And most importantly, do you think we make too many snap judgments about people based on how they look? Rate this story from 0 to 10. Let me know what you think. Tell me whether you've ever been judged based on your appearance in a way that affected how people treated you. Tell me what you think it means to be authentic in a profession that expects you to conform to certain standards. And please, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, subscribe now. Turn on that notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Because there are so many stories like this one. So many stories about people who refuse to conform to expectations. So many stories about the power of being authentically yourself in a world that constantly tries to make you something else. I'll see you next time.